at Ramstein Air Base, which is the largest American base in Germany. You had a meeting today with all these European defense ministers and Austin Lloyd, the U.S. Defense Secretary, and basically, the big issue in the news right now is, should Germany give the Ukrainians their main battle tank, which is the Leopard or Leopard 2, right? The Leopard 2. So it's not a new tank, right? I think they built this in the 70s originally, but it's still one of the best. And the current position from the Germans is that they don't want to escalate the war with the Russians, because, the last time you had German tanks killing Russians, well, let's just say the German tanks didn't do so well. Right? Remember, the Russians inflicted 80%, 8 with a 0, 80% of all German casualties in World War II. That is fucking colossal. That is colossal. So, the Germans don't want to be in that position again. And the funny thing is that they've told the Americans, look, you want us to send these tanks to the Ukrainians, we will only give them the Leopard 2s if you give them the M1 Abrams. M1 Abrams is the American equivalent. This is the M1A2. Okay, so that's the American main battle tank, and this is the Leopard 2, the German one, right? The funny thing is actually the barrel, or I should say the cannon that's on the turret here, right? This is the L44 model, and the American one is the L55. Actually, it's basically a modification of the German version. The Americans are funny because they of course, there's the military-industrial complex, but this is licensed and they build it in the U.S., but they can't take it as it is, right? They have to modify it and make it American. Anyway, I just want to say that these tanks are both good, but the Americans are saying, well, we can't give you the Ukrainians, we can't give you the M1 because it's not suited. It's not suited for your applications. I'll get to what that means in a second. They're talking about how much fuel it guzzles. Let's go through this article from the New York Times, okay? So it's called Why Tanks Are Tripping Up the West. So now Canada will send 200 personnel carriers to Ukraine. Personnel carriers, usually when you talk about personnel carriers, it's basically, if it's an armored personnel carrier, an APC, it looks like a tank. Sometimes they have turrets on them, but it's basically, literally, as the name implies, it's an armored vehicle that's just meant for carrying troops in from 6 to 12 throughout the battlefield. Not all of them are weaponized and not all of them are armored. So in this case, personnel carriers, it's quite vague. Canada sending 200 of them. Britain will donate 600 missiles, and Sweden is giving Ukraine artillery systems and armored vehicles. Okay. The United States is also going to ship 100 additional fighting vehicles. So those are Bradleys. I'll get to that in a second. The article says, so far missing from a new weapons package that officials from NATO states will reaffirm at the Ramstein Air Base in Germany are American and German-made tanks, right? So again, the M1A2 and the Leopard 2. That Ukraine's leaders say are desperately needed. The debate over whether either country will allow their tanks onto Ukraine's battlefields has been brewing for months, but after British officials gave word last week that they would send a platoon of Challenger 2 tanks to Ukraine, demands have amped up for Berlin and Washington to quickly follow suit. So Challenger 2, as you can probably guess, is the British equivalent, right? It's the main British battle tank. Britain is the only Western country that's actually sent its main battle tank to Ukraine. So, and the Challenger 2 is, up there with the Leopard 2, the M1A2, and the Russian T92. So yeah, it's a very good tank. This ground warfare expert said that the pressure campaign by Ukraine and its immediate neighbors in Eastern Europe harkened back to a lesson from World War II when the US supplied the British Army with Sherman tanks to beat back enemy forces in Europe and North Africa. Okay, can we stop with this? Like every fucking second somebody's saying like, oh, well, Zelensky is Winston Churchill. Oh, no. Now he's Montgomery. He's also Patton. He's Montgomery and Patton rolled into one. He's a Sherman tank. He has a cannon sticking out of his ass. This is so ridiculous. It's not even comparable. So Ukraine's most senior military commander has said that his forces need about 300 Western tanks. Oh, is that all? Can I get you anything else? Would you like some nukes to go with that? Over the last year, NATO allies in Eastern Europe supplied Ukraine with Soviet-era and Russian-made tanks that have been ground down or destroyed in constant fighting. Okay, this is a very important sentence, and let's break this down. Soviet era and Russian-made tanks. Now, Ukraine, having been a Soviet satellite state and part of the Soviet Union, it was part of Russia, and you know, all of its military personnel being trained on Russian tanks. What do you think they're going to do with American tanks or German tanks? They're not trained, which they are not trained to operate. Again, Ukrainians know how to operate Russian tanks. That's all they know how to operate. The Ukrainians only use Soviet stuff, right? Until the last couple of years and until now. This is the first major influx of NATO weapons. And again, 2014, since then, yes, they've been training them. NATO's been training Ukrainian forces, but the influx of weapons and you know, I mean, Challenger tanks, this is brand new. If they can't even use the tanks that they're trained to use, what makes you so confident they're going to know how to use a Leopard 2 or an M1A2 or a Challenger 2? Man, people train on those things for fucking months and years. In any case, providing these sophisticated battle tanks, one of the most powerful symbols of war, was long seen as a red line by the United States and its closest European allies who feared Russian retaliation. But the debate shifted this month, with France, Germany, and the United States announcing plans to send for the first time armored vehicles to Ukraine to help in the grinding ground war. And again, they make a mention of the Challenger 2 tanks, so they'll be there in a couple of weeks. Why is Germany reluctant to send tanks? That's a really tough one. I wonder why. Germany has long refused to send its most potent weapons to countries in conflict, a byproduct of its legacy of starting World War II and World War I. That's horse manure, because Germany does send weapons to countries in war. You know, Saudi Arabia is one of them. So to get around this, the trick that they use is they don't sell the tanks and the ordnance directly to Saudi Arabia. They move it to Italy, and then from Italy they sell it to the Saudis. So they basically just insert a middleman, and that's how they get around this very honorable principle of theirs, which they never abide by. If you go and you look up the Yemen war, I mean, you're going to see weapons from fucking everywhere. You know, the Canadians have been selling weapons and making money. Britain, the U.S., Australia, everyone. And the Germans are no exception. So I mean, this is just factually incorrect. I don't know how this got past an editor, but I mean, again, the first part, the idea is true, but they fucking send weapons. They goddamn do. They do. The article says that has included prohibiting the export of its Leopard 2 tanks to Ukraine, even those that have been sold to other armies. So, I think they estimate there's like 2,000 of these tanks in Europe. You know, between 13 countries. And just because you bought a tank from Germany, it doesn't mean you can give the tank to somebody else, right? So in arms exports, the licenses are explicitly for use by the client, okay? Just because Poland has Leopard 2 tanks doesn't mean they can just give them to Ukraine. Practically, literally, I guess they could, but they never get any new ones from Germany, right? So you have countries in Europe that are saying, okay, well, if Germany won't give the Leopard 2 tanks to Ukraine, we'll give them. We'll give them from our own stockpile. No, it doesn't work like that. They must get permission from Germany. And according to the Germans, there's not one single country that has actually submitted a request. So, even though they've said this publicly, no one's actually asked if they can give their tanks to Ukraine. So the Chancellor Olaf Scholz has repeatedly said that he would not go it alone when it comes to sending weapons into Ukraine, and he would only act in concert with allies. So again, this goes back to we're only giving them tanks if you give them tanks, right? And I respect it. It's nice seeing the Germans have some balls for once, because usually they just do what they're told by Uncle Sam, and they go back and sit quietly in the corner. So it's interesting for them to say, well, look, we'll send them if you send them. and the response from the White House is what? Oh no, we can't do that because they're just not suited, right? Here's what they say. U.S. officials said they would send Strykers and Bradleys. So these are, a couple of fighting vehicles, 50 Bradley fighting vehicles pledged this month. But when it comes to the M1 Abrams, again, the M1 Abrams, with their specific need for fuel, frequent maintenance and spare parts, transport and training, the Biden administration says they are ill-suited to battle in eastern Ukraine, where supply lines could easily be cut off. A Pentagon spokeswoman told reporters that it just doesn't make sense to provide Ukraine with Abrams tanks at this moment because they use jet fuel and are difficult to maintain. They said Germans must make up their own minds about the Leopard 2s. That is true. You know, the United States, one of the reasons it can use these tanks is because of its logistical supply line. You know, I mean, logistics is really the most difficult part of running any army in history, and it's always been like that. And because the Americans have so many bases, because of the petrodollar, because of, you know, the way they run the world, they're able to maintain these tanks. Sure. And Ukraine, I guess, unless they hand over their supply line to Ukraine, which I doubt they're going to do, perhaps it's unrealistic. And yes, the Leopard 2 is better suited. I'm not saying for Ukraine specifically, just, you know, in the field, it's probably a better tank all around. But I think this is some bullshit excuse. They don't want to have the Germans, you know, telling them what to do or having to abide by the conditions of the Germans. I think that's more what it's about. It's not because, you know, they don't want to make the money or they don't want to you know, attack the Russians. It's not about that. It's about, you know, we tell you what to do, so fucking send them your German tanks, and that's it. We're not going to give you American tanks because you want us to. No, we'll do that if we want it and we choose to do so. So here they go on to say, the New York Times, more broadly, officials worry that American tanks would be seen as a sign of escalation by the United States, a risky step for a global superpower that is trying to avoid a broader conflict. Really? You think so, huh? So, you know, those HIMARS that you gave the Ukrainians, all that training, the coup, you know, the sanctions, that's not an escalation. It's the M1A2 that's the escalation. Wow, who would have thought? Who would have thunk it, right? Who would have thought this was the red line right here? This little piece of this tin can coffin. Who would have thought? Interesting. I mean, do you guys believe this? It's definitely an escalation. Don't get me wrong, but we've been saying this, you know, a year ago. Every single thing you do extra is an escalation. I mean, you know, no one is complaining about Bradleys, surely, right? It's the risk of nuclear war, I think, is much more serious than an M1A2. And yet they don't seem to mention that. Weird. Let me show you some of the videos. So here's Lloyd Austin, so the U.S. Defense Secretary, speaking at Rammstein today.
We're also pushing hard to meet Ukraine's requirements for tanks and other armored vehicles. The UK has announced a significant donation of Challenger 2 tanks for Ukraine. And this is the first introduction of Western main battle tanks into Ukraine. And I also commend our British allies for making this decision. And Sweden announced it's donating CV-90 infantry fighting vehicles. And an additional donation.
That came out so bitter, and I thank our British allies. I think what's going on in Whitehall is, you know, as usual, you have these people running around Westminster and Whitehall with these raging hard-ons about bringing back the British Empire, and so, you know, even though it's public, you know, in an attempt to protrude, no pun intended, and have Britain in the forefront, they're like, fuck it, we'll give them the tanks. Take the Challengers. Take our tanks, please. We beg you, take our tanks. Here, let me show you the Germans, okay? I'll show you Zelensky and then the Germans.
The war started by Russia does not allow delays. And I can thank you hundreds of times, and it will be absolutely just and fair, given all that we have already done. But hundreds of thank you are not hundreds of tanks. All of us can use thousands of wars.
That's not true. Zelensky, oh boy, haven't you ever heard of killing people with kindness?
Discussions, but I cannot put wars.
Oh snap! I removed the president. Excuse me.
All of us can use thousands of wars in discussions, but I cannot put wars instead of guns that are needed against Russian artillery, or instead of the anti-aircraft missile that are needed to protect people from Russian airstrikes. And I am truly grateful to all of you for the weapons you have provided every unit helps to save our people from terror, but time remains a Russian weapon. We have to speed up. The war.
Yeah. You know, Slava Ukraina and stuff. So here's the German defense minister who I'm not kidding. He literally got this job like yesterday. I think in like a few hours before the meeting. Yeah, here he is. I had the German one. I'm going to give you the English one as well.
Panzer. Ich jedenfalls nicht. Sie wissen warum. We are not really hesitating. We are just very carefully in balance and all the pros and contras. We are not talking just about delivering anything to anybody. This is a new kind of measure we would choose. So we have to be carefully because we have a duty to look carefully.
If you buy a Leopard 2, a mock-up of Arnold Schwarzenegger comes with it too.
And intensively on what might be the consequences for anybody in that conflict. We will make our decisions as soon as possible. And as I already mentioned, we support Ukraine in a very, very big measure, and we will continue doing this. We don't fear anything. We have just responsibility for our population in Germany and in Europe. And we have to balance all the pros and contras before we decide things like that, just like that. This is nothing else. And I'm very sure that there will be a decision in the short term, but I don't know why, and I don't know how the decision will look. Priorität Nummer 1 ist Luftverteidigung, Luftverteidigung, Luftverteidigung. Insbesondere auch mit
Look, man, I know you're new. I know you got your job like literally today. Okay. But his name is Boris, what's again? Pistorius, I think. Yeah. I know you just got the job, but don't do this. Don't do this. Please don't do this, because just from a historical standpoint, you know, German tanks and German politicians, they don't do too well against Russians, you know? they just don't. Just don't do it, you know, do something else. Maybe send them chocolate, send them like rations, you know, K rations or something, just not tanks. You're going to end up with a lot of angry customers. So here's the Chancellor, Olaf Scholz. And again, I'll remind you that, well, just listen to him speak and then I'll tell you, okay?
Which are very important in this common task to defend the Ukrainian independence and sovereignty. As I said in my speech, we will continue to do this as long as necessary. It is also clear that we will avoid that this is becoming a war between Russia and NATO. I think this is something which is also the view of the Ukrainians, as far as I understand with all my talks, and we will continue to be active in this way to do this. My willingness, the willingness of Germany, the willingness of the European Union and all the supporters of the Ukrainian nation is that they will be able to become an independent, free, democratic nations which will go the way to the European Union and will join it. And this is what we do.
I mean, Germany's been occupied by the U.S. for like 70 years, so I don't know what he means with, you know, democratic and free. But okay, I'll just remind you with Scholz a few months ago, there was this controversy about, again, tanks, right? Not Leopard 2s. They were much older and crappier, but nevertheless tanks. And he was saying, I don't want to send these armored vehicles to the Ukrainians because, same thing, it will escalate with Russia. And he was taking hits left and right, and then eventually, after a couple of days, he gave in. I don't know how long this guy's gonna last, because the calls for Germany to send the tanks from inside the Reichstag, sorry, Bundestag now, it's coming from literally left and right, literally. Okay, you got everybody, the majority of them saying, yeah, we should send it to them. But if you look at opinion polls, as it said in the New York Times, in the among the German population, they support Ukraine, but they don't agree with sending them armored vehicles because it represents an escalation. I mean, look, that's obviously true. It's obviously correct. Tanks are a very potent symbol of war. These German tanks are also very effective. It depends, of course, if the Ukrainians are well trained and have the time to train, enough to make them effective on the battlefield. But I'm confused, because there are many other things that have already happened where, anyone with half a brain was looking at this and saying, why are you escalating with Russia? This is dangerous. And there wasn't even a debate about that. You know, I mean, sanctions is one form of this escalation. Blowing up Nord Stream 2. I mean, no one even talks about that anymore. You know, that's not something to happen in space or inside Russia, or, you know, it happened in the, I mean, not soil, but the economic exclusive zone of Denmark, Sweden, Germany. So it does concern them. It's on their soil, you know, technically speaking. They don't give a shit. Like, you don't even hear about it in the news anymore. Someone fucking blew up a pipeline, too, actually, right? And there's no news about that. It's just kind of forgotten. You know, they all know who did it. You know who did it. I know who did it. The Americans and the British blew up that fucking pipeline. And they're so embarrassed and so under control of NATO and Washington and Whitehall. They're too embarrassed to say that. So once again, I'm glad they're concerned with, you know, not escalating with Russia, but you're already doing that, and you've been doing that for many years. You know, the coup, 2014, the sanctions, the pipeline, the HIMARS, right? So again, I know they didn't give them the long range ones, but still, it's a complex weapon system. Blowing up the Crimea bridge, going off and helping the Ukrainians. This is the Americans helping the Ukrainians target Russian generals. All of that's escalation. And now you're whining about some tanks. Man, there are bigger things than that, but you don't seem to care, and no one debates that. Now, again, just for the curious among you, the Russian counterpart would be the T92. So again, the Russians, they make very good tanks. You know, one of the things in World War II where it's not the only aspect, but you could say it's certainly a major one, is the Russian industry, right? So, you know, when the Germans invaded Russia, they had bad intelligence. They underestimated the Russian numbers, troop numbers, and they underestimated the Russians' abilities to literally transport their industry forward and meet the demand necessary to overcome the invading Germans, right? And so, you know, if you compare the German tanks, tanks have always been, you know, a central part of the German military, especially in World War II. That was literally the whole Blitzkrieg, you know, this lightning war, invading France, invading Poland, was done with tanks, right? And it's only 20%, only 1/5 of the German army that was mechanized. But it was so potent, you know, these Panzer IVs that they were sending in. I mean, they were just literally blazing past the enemy positions and just overcoming them because they're so effective. And then, despite this, bringing out tanks that were more advanced. That I mean, the Tiger tank is really, if I showed you a picture of the Tiger tank, you would think it's a modern tank because they all look very, very, very similar, right? 80 millimeter cannon. Now, of course, these have the 120 millimeter guns, but you know, that tank, even though it was very sophisticated and it was very advanced, it was prone to breaking down. And it had all of these problems that it's kind of ironic that the Pentagon spokesperson listed for the American one, the M1A2, that, oh, well, this thing, it guzzles too much fuel. It takes a long time to train the crew. If there's replacement or repair needed, it takes a long time to do that. And that's the same problem the Germans had with the Tiger tank, right? So the Russians, in the meantime, they're building, you know, if you put them next to each other, you know, a T-34, it's a tiny little thing. And they were able to mass produce it. But that, you know, in a war of attrition, that's what counts. So the Germans having a fancier tank was fucking irrelevant because the Russians, just by the sheer quantity of tanks they were able to produce with the industry that they had, you know, they were able to beat back the Germans. So again, you know, I understand the Ukrainians saying, oh, we desperately need all of these tanks. But number one, they don't have the time to train the crews on them. And having the best technology is not everything. If the Germans send German tanks once again to kill Russians, directly or indirectly, then they have learned fucking nothing whatsoever from any world war and the Cold War. Just absolute stupidity.